The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows over the quiet suburban street. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened, where front lawns were trimmed to perfection, mailboxes stood unbothered, and the biggest concern was whether the trash bins were placed out on time. For James Carter, that was the appeal. After years of high-stakes operations, split-second decisions, and the ever-present weight of danger, this was his retreat. A place where no one knew his past, and he could finally breathe. But peace has a funny way of being temporary. One evening, as he sifted through his mail, a thick white envelope caught his attention. The words, "Homeowners Association Violation Notice," were stamped across it in bold red ink. His brows furrowed. HOA? That didn't make sense. When James bought this house, he made sure it was outside of any HOA's reach. He had no patience for petty suburban politics, let alone a committee dictating how he lived. Still, curiosity got the best of him. He tore it open and scanned the neatly printed letter. Immediate action required. You are in violation of HOA regulations. Failure to comply will result in legal consequences. The document listed a series of absurd infractions: unauthorized exterior paint color, grass exceeding allowable length, and the most ridiculous of all, failure to seek approval for a personal vehicle in the driveway. James let out a dry chuckle. His black Dodge Charger had been parked in that driveway for years, and no one had ever said a word. Something felt off. The letter was detailed, official-looking, but too aggressive, too threatening for a first notice. His instincts kicked in. Who was behind this? He checked the return address, but it led nowhere. Just a generic P.O. box. That's when he noticed the signature at the bottom. Karen Whitmore, HOA President. The name didn't ring a bell, but the fact that an HOA president was issuing fines for a non-HOA neighborhood sent a chill down his spine. Something wasn't right, and James Carter never ignored a bad feeling. James didn't have to wait long for the next move. The following afternoon, just as he was finishing his coffee, the sound of tires crunching over gravel made him glance. Out the window. A white SUV had pulled up in front of his house. The doors swung open, and 3 men stepped out, dressed in what could only be described as bargain bin security uniforms. Black polo shirts with HOA enforcement printed across, the chest and cheap plastic badges clipped to their belts. James felt his muscles tense. These guys weren't city officials. That much was obvious. They were playing pretend, but for what purpose? A woman emerged from the passenger side last, her presence radiating a smug authority. Karen Whitmore. She was exactly what James expected. Mid-50s, sharp features, and an expression that suggested she had spent a lifetime making other people's business her own. She adjusted her sunglasses, then strutted up his driveway like she owned the place. The 3 men followed, their postures stiff, like they were trying too hard to look intimidating. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. James opened the door before they had a chance to knock. Can I help you? His voice was calm, measured. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if one came, he'd be ready. Karen didn't waste time. She held up a clipboard, tapping a printed violation notice with perfectly manicured nails. Mr. Carter, you are in direct violation of HOA regulations. We gave you ample warning, and now immediate compliance is required. Her voice dripped with fake politeness, but the threat underneath was clear. James raised an eyebrow. HOA regulations? He folded his arms across his chest. There is no HOA in this neighborhood. Never has been. The 3 officers shifted uncomfortably, but Karen didn't flinch. She forced a tight-lipped smile. That's where you're mistaken. As of last year, our organization has taken jurisdiction over this community to protect property values and ensure compliance with neighborhood standards. James let out a small chuckle. Jurisdiction? He glanced at the men beside her. Cheap shoes, nervous eyes, hands twitching at their belts like they were waiting for permission to escalate. These weren't HOA enforcers. They were something else entirely. Karen took a step closer, lowering her voice. We've already fined several of your neighbors, and they've complied without issue. But you? She shook her head. You're being difficult. Difficult, James repeated, his tone light, but his mind already racing. She was pushing for a reaction. He could feel the tension rising in the air, like the split second before a trigger is pulled. One of the men, a stocky guy with a bad goatee, stepped forward. His badge gleamed under the sun. Look, buddy, he grumbled. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. You don't want to pay the fine? That's fine. But we'll have to take action. James tilted his head slightly. And what action is that? Goatee smirked. We'll start by towing that car of yours. Then maybe we'll detain you until we can sort this out. That word, detain, set off every alarm in James's head. HOAs don't detain people. Neither do code enforcement officers. But fake cops? Scammers trying to strong-arm homeowners into handing over money? They do, James inhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. His instincts were screaming now. These guys weren't just con artists. They were dangerous. Tell you what, he said, stepping back into his house. Why don't you wait right here? He shut the door before they could answer. Then, moving with the kind of quiet precision that came from years of training, he headed to his study and retrieved his badge and firearm. If these people thought they could intimidate him, they had no idea who they were dealing with, and they were about to find out. James didn't believe in coincidences, especially not ones that came dressed as fake law enforcement and threats of illegal detainment. After shutting the door on Karen and her self-appointed officers, he wasted no time. He grabbed his laptop, settled into his desk, and started digging. If these people were running a scam, there had to be a trail somewhere. A quick search of Whitmore HOA returned nothing. No official registration, no legal documentation, not even a mention in local records. Legitimate homeowners associations were required to be filed with the city and state. But this one, it didn't exist. No bylaws, no financial reports, nothing. The deeper James looked, the clearer it became. Karen's so-called HOA was a ghost. He expanded his search, scanning community forums and local complaint boards. That's when the real picture started forming. Dozens of posts from homeowners in nearby neighborhoods, all telling eerily similar stories. Bogus violation notices, aggressive officers demanding payments, cars towed in the dead of night, and even threats of legal action that never materialized. Some people had paid up out of fear, while others had their homes vandalized after refusing. A pattern was emerging, and it wasn't just some nosy neighborhood committee overstepping its bounds. This was an organized extortion racket. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. How many people had they scammed? How much money had they raked in? And more importantly, how far were they willing to go to keep their operation running? Determined to get answers, he stepped outside and started knocking on doors. Most neighbors were hesitant at first. Some barely cracked their doors open, eyes wary, voices hushed. But as soon as James mentioned Karen and her officers, the dam broke. They towed my son's truck and demanded $500 to get it back. I refused to pay, and the next morning my mailbox was smashed in. They told me I owed back dues for an HOA that didn't even exist when I bought my house. They have keys to the community gate. How did they even get those? The more people talked, the clearer it became. Fear had kept them silent. Karen and her goons had created an illusion of power, making themselves look like an official HOA, using fake documents, intimidation, and brute force to milk homeowners for thousands of dollars. James clenched his jaw. This wasn't just some suburban scam. It was organized crime, hidden behind a layer of petty suburban bureaucracy. And they had just picked a fight with the wrong man. James knew Karen wouldn't back down easily. People like her never did. When their intimidation tactics failed, they doubled down, convinced they could bend reality to their will. He had been expecting a counterplay, but even he wasn't prepared for how far she'd go. It started with a letter taped to his front door. Unlike the previous HOA violations, this one had a mock legal tone, complete with a fake case number, and a demand for an outrageous amount, $5,000 in unpaid HOA dues and penalties. The kicker? The letter claimed that repeated refusal to comply had resulted in a formal complaint filed with local authorities. James read it twice and almost laughed. A fake legal notice? She was getting desperate. But what came next wiped the smirk off his face. Just before sunset, 2 black and white SUVs rolled onto his street, red and blue lights flashing. Uniformed officers stepped out, except something was off. Their badges looked cheap, their belts carried no radios, and their movements weren't as sharp as real cops. But to the average person, they looked legitimate enough. Neighbors peeked through their windows. Some stepped onto their porches, whispering among themselves. That was the point. Public humiliation. Karen wanted to make an example out of him. One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, with an expression full of manufactured authority, marched up his driveway. "James Carter." James didn't answer. He just stared, his mind processing every detail. The stance, the tone, the way the man's uniform fit just a little too loose. This wasn't law enforcement. This was theater. "We have an arrest warrant for multiple violations and failure to comply with a court summons," the man continued, pulling out a stack of paperwork that looked official but had no real identifiers. James folded his arms, keeping his expression neutral. "Which court issued this?" The officer faltered for half a second. Just long enough. Real cops don't hesitate when citing legal authority. "Sir, step away from the house," the man ordered, trying to regain control. "Don't make this difficult." Karen stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her smug grin barely contained. She was waiting for him to resist, waiting for him to give her an excuse to escalate. James exhaled slowly, then took one deliberate step forward. "Where's your badge from?" His voice was calm, but now everyone watching could hear it. Doubt. The fake officer bristled. "Step away! From the house!" James tilted his head slightly. "What agency are you with?" More whispers spread through the crowd. Even the neighbors, who had mostly kept their distance, were beginning to notice the cracks. Karen's smug expression twitched. She saw it too. The moment control started slipping from her grasp. James let the silence stretch before giving them the final push over the edge. "You're under the impression that I'm just some guy who doesn't know his rights." He took it another step forward, his eyes locked on the fake officers. Then, in one swift motion, he pulled his own badge from his pocket and held it up. "U.S. Marshal. If you take one more step toward me under false authority, you're going to regret it." The street fell into absolute silence. Karen's face drained of color. The fake officers? Their bravado collapsed in real time. One of them took an instinctive step back. James let the badge speak for itself. Then, after a long pause, he smiled. "Now, let's talk about impersonating law enforcement." The game had just flipped. James could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him as the tension in the air thickened. The fake officers stood their ground, their cheap badges reflecting the setting sun, but James could see the cracks forming in their confidence. They weren't used to being questioned. They expected him to panic, to go along with their charade, but instead he stood perfectly still, watching, analyzing. He let them think they were in control. The taller of the 2 fake officers, the one who had been doing most of the talking, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, I'm not gonna ask again. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." His voice was firm, but James caught the slightest hesitation in it now. James nodded slowly, keeping his expression neutral. "All right," he said, voice steady. "I'll comply." A flicker of satisfaction crossed the man's face as he pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The second officer stepped closer, reaching for his radio. Except James had already noticed, the radio wasn't turned on. These guys were amateurs playing at authority. He let the first officer grab his wrist. That was their mistake. In a single fluid motion, James yanked his arm away, twisted the man's wrist at an angle that sent the cuffs clattering to the pavement, and stepped into his space, a move so quick and precise that the second officer didn't even have time to react. The taller man grunted in pain, staggering back. His partner froze, his hand halfway to his fake holster. Too slow. And that was when James pulled his own badge. The small golden emblem of the United States Marshals. Service gleamed under the streetlights. "U.S. Marshal," James said, his voice calm but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. "And you two just made the worst mistake of your lives." The taller fake cop stumbled back, his face going pale. What? Karen visibly tensed. This wasn't going how she planned. The second officer swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. This has to be a joke." James took a deliberate step forward. "Impersonating a federal officer. Attempted unlawful detainment. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Shall I go on?" The crowd of neighbors was silent, watching the scene unfold like something out of a crime thriller. Whispers rippled through them. "He's a U.S. Marshal?" The fake officers looked at Karen, waiting for guidance, waiting for an escape, but there wasn't one. Karen's face twisted with fury, but James caught something else beneath it. Fear. "Walk away, Marshal," she spat, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "This isn't your business." James tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're running an illegal extortion racket under the guise of an HOA, hiring criminals to pose as law enforcement, and you just tried to arrest a federal agent on his own property." He let that sink in. "This is very much my business," the taller fake cop lunged. "Wrong move." James sidestepped effortlessly, grabbed the man's arm, and used his own momentum against him, flipping him onto the pavement with a heavy thud. The man groaned, clutching his shoulder. The second officer took a panicked step back, hands up. Look, I didn't sign up for this," he stammered, shaking his head. "She told us—" "Shut up," Karen snapped. James didn't even glance at her. He focused on the second officer. "Smart choice. Get on the ground, hands behind your head." The man obeyed without question. Karen, however, still had one last move left. She turned on her heel, making a break for her SUV, but James had been waiting for that. Before she could reach the door, he called out one final warning. "You run, and I'll make sure you spend the next decade behind bars." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the car handle. "You think I won't?" James continued, voice low, controlled. "You've already committed enough felonies to put you away for years. But fleeing an arrest? That'll make it worse." Her breathing was ragged. She knew he was right. Slowly, she turned around, hands trembling as she raised them in surrender. The neighborhood, once a silent audience, suddenly erupted in murmurs. The scam was over. The fear she had built her power on had crumbled in an instant. James pulled out his phone, dialing the real cops. "Yeah, this is Deputy U.S. Marshal James Carter," he said, his tone cool. "I've got 3 suspects in custody for impersonating law enforcement and running an extortion scheme. You might want to send a few units down here." He turned his gaze back to Karen. "Looks like you finally got the police you wanted. And this time, they were real." As James stood over the subdued imposters, the weight of what had just happened settled over the neighborhood. Karen's empire of fear had crumbled in real time, and the people she once intimidated were now whispering among themselves, some in shock, others in anger. The scam had thrived on silence and submission, but tonight, that silence was broken. James kept his eyes on Karen as he spoke into his phone. "Yeah, I have multiple suspects in custody. I also have evidence of fraudulent legal documents, extortion, and impersonation of law enforcement. You're gonna want to bring extra units." His voice was calm, almost casual, as if he had done this 100 times before, which, in a way, he had. As soon as he ended the call, a voice spoke up from the crowd. "You said impersonation?" It was Mr. Dawson, an older man from 2 houses down. He stepped forward, his face lined with anger. "These people tried to fine me last year for parking my own truck in my own driveway. They even threatened to have it towed." Another neighbor chimed in. "They told me I had to pay a maintenance fee, but they wouldn't show me any records. They harassed my wife," someone else muttered. One by one, the stories poured out. The fake HOA had been more than just a scam. It was a reign of terror. They targeted the elderly, single parents, anyone they thought wouldn't fight back. Karen, still on her knees, shook her head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous. We were just enforcing community standards. You people are ungrateful." "Shut up, Karen," James said flatly, and then came the distant wail of sirens. Karen's head snapped up. The second fake officer, the one who had been hesitant before, visibly panicked. He looked at the flashing lights approaching in the distance, then at his partner, still groaning on the pavement. And he made his move. James saw the shift in his stance a second before he bolted. The man sprinted toward the side of the house, hoping to disappear into the dark. Too late. James took 3 quick strides before launching himself forward, tackling the guy with practiced ease. The impact sent them both crashing onto the lawn. The man struggled, but James had already pinned him, twisting his arm behind his back. "You're not running from this," James muttered. By the time he hauled the man to his feet, the real cops had arrived. Squad cars pulled up fast, red and blue, lights bouncing off the houses. Officers stepped out with weapons drawn, quickly assessing the scene. James lifted his badge, identifying himself as a deputy U.S. Marshal. It only took a few words for them to understand what had happened. As Karen and her fake enforcers were placed in handcuffs, this time by real cops, James turned to the crowd of neighbors. "This is over," he told them, "and it's not coming back." For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. Karen sat in the back of the police cruiser, her face twisted in disbelief. Even as the officers secured the doors, she thrashed against the cuffs, shouting protests. "This is a mistake. You don't understand. I was just trying to keep this community in order." James stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her unravel. "Community?" he scoffed. "You ran a scam. You bullied people, stole from them, and tried to arrest me on my own property." He shook his head. "You're lucky I didn't charge you with kidnapping." Karen's eyes burned with fury, but there was nothing she could do now. The scam had collapsed, and all her power, her fake authority, her reign of control, was gone. Nearby, the officers finished rounding up her enforcers. The taller fake cop, the one James had taken down first, kept his head down, as if avoiding eye contact might somehow lessen his involvement. The second officer, the one who had tried to run, looked completely defeated. As they were loaded into separate cruisers, a voice called out from the gathered neighbors. "Hey, Karen!" It was Mrs. Lee, an elderly woman from 3 houses down. She had been one of Karen's favorite targets. They had fined her repeatedly for violations that didn't exist, even threatening to put a lien on her home. Now, standing among the crowd, she smiled for the first time in years. "Looks like you just got evicted." A wave of laughter swept through the neighbors. It wasn't cruel. It was relief. For too long, they had felt powerless, trapped under Karen's fake rules. But now, as they stood together watching justice unfold, there was a sense of unity they hadn't felt in a long time. One of the officers approached James. We've got everything we need. We'll be charging them with fraud, impersonating law enforcement, and extortion. Probably more once we dig deeper." He gave James a nod of respect. "Good work, Marshal." James returned the nod. "Glad I could help." As the last cruiser pulled away, the atmosphere shifted. The tension that had loomed over the neighborhood for years finally lifted. People smiled, spoke freely. Some even cheered. "You know," Mr. Dawson said, stepping up beside James, "I think this calls for a celebration." A murmur of agreement swept through the group. Someone suggested a neighborhood BBQ. Another neighbor offered their backyard for a gathering. "Let's make it a real community event," Mrs. Lee said, eyes twinkling. "No fake HOAs required." James chuckled. "Now that's a rule I can get behind." As the neighbors dispersed, planning their well-earned celebration, James took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. It had been a long, unexpected fight. But standing there, watching the people reclaim their community, he knew one thing for certain: justice had been served. James had seen plenty of scams in his time as a U.S. Marshal, but this one still gnawed at him. Something about it felt unfinished. Karen had been arrogant. Too arrogant. Most con artists, once caught, either begged for mercy or stayed silent. Karen had fought like she still had something to lose. So when his phone buzzed a week later, with a call from Detective Ruiz, the lead investigator on the case, he wasn't surprised, just intrigued. "You were right," Ruiz said without preamble. "This wasn't just a petty HOA scam. Karen was part of something bigger." James leaned back in his chair. "How big are we talking?" Ruiz exhaled. "Big enough that we just opened a federal case, as it turned out the fake HOA had been just the tip of the iceberg. Karen and her so-called enforcers weren't just extorting homeowners, they were laundering money. Fines, membership fees, legal threats, all of it had been funneled into Shell. Companies moved around until it disappeared. And Karen? She wasn't just a suburban tyrant. She was a small cog in a much bigger machine. She was working with others," Ruiz continued. "We're still tracing the money, but we found connections to fraud rings in 3 different states. If we dig deeper, who knows what else we'll find." James let out a low whistle. "Guess she wasn't just after power. She was after a payday." Ruiz chuckled. "Well, she's not getting one where she's going. RICO charges are already on the table." James smirked. Justice had been served, but it wasn't over yet. As he hung up, he stepped outside, taking in the sight of his now peaceful neighborhood. No fake violations, no threats, no Karen. Just quiet. For the first time in a long time, the place actually felt like home. But still, something told him this wouldn't be the last time he ran into a scam like this. With a final glance at the street, he shook his head and muttered, "Some people never learn." If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.